First, let me say that this is a talk that I have prepared with my colleague and friend Osiris Gonzalez Romero. And I will introduce us both now. First, Osiris had unfortunately cancelled his participation a week ago because of a surgery he has to undergo in Mexico. He is a philosopher, one of the members of Via Synapsis that have been running a psychedelic conference since 2014 every year at the Autonomous University of Mexico. And he's had a PhD from Leiden, has a PhD from Leiden in the Department of Archaeology and the Heritage of Indigenous Peoples, and is now a postdoc with Erica Dick at the University of Saskatchewan, working on psychedelic humanities. I'm a professor of philosophy here at the University of Exeter. I've started working together with Peter Shestertjus on psychedelics and philosophy about 4 years ago. And as you may know, we have a growing network of collaborations here at the university with the psychology department in particular, but also increasingly others, and an international network, and run transdisciplinary colloquia and teach philosophy and psychedelics here in our master's program. But so now let me come to the talk. I will be trying to pull in things from the previous talks, but also start with the introduction of the key terms. So I said I will speak about 3 main topics here, and they are as listed in the abstract and listed on here. Sadly, I'm too old to read what it says on this back screen here that is going to give me all the indications of what is on my slides. So I will be doing a funny dance, like this, and then back again, okay? Don't worry, I'm all right. So I will be talking about biocultural colonization, clinical colonization, and psychological internal colonizations, all of which on the assumption that actually these happen within the psychedelic space at present. I will, however, begin with defining a few terms, and one of them is an ethic. So if we are looking for a decolonizing ethic of the psychedelic space, what does this actually mean? Everybody thinks they know what ethics means. It's a philosophical study of what is the right and the wrong thing to do. But actually, it comes from a Greek term that is maybe more relevant for what this is about. It's what Claudia mentioned as in the integration of different aspects of the ethics. It's an attitude towards a whole field that might integrate and bring together a whole complex web of being respectful and mindful and caring towards one's environment. So this is about acute awareness of past colonial violence. How can we act upon the legacy responsibilities and prevent new injustices that happen with, in particular, the medicalisation of psychedelics? Then such an ethic is always contextualized and situated. Claudia explained that. And the aim of it is, it's a political agenda in this ethic. This is not just about doing right or wrong. It is really about creating a world and an environment in which psychedelics can be used and consumed in such a way that we actually not only we respect and are mindful of old harms and take care to prevent new harms. So decolonizing is really an unclear term, as Marcia said. There are many different ways of using this. It's a very fashionable term at the moment. And there is a big debate about should we read this narrowly or widely? I'm arguing very much for a wider interpretation in the context of psychedelics. And one reason, or some of the concepts I'm drawing on this, is on the one hand that medicalisation itself can be seen as a form of colonizing. Yeah? It is colonizing the spaces of how we feel. Everything comes, the ways we are, become increasingly read through the lens of diagnosis and therapy, and with that become what it is the authority of medics to sort out for us. Yeah, and another theorist from the Frankfurt School, professor I studied with when I was very young, developed this concept of a discourse ethic, and one of the key parameters of it is that we actually respond to what he calls the encroachment of the technocratic rationality of a capitalist economy and formalized forms of democracy upon society in such a way that really proper discourses and respectful or caring ways of proceeding can hardly be developed. Everything is sort of tied in with this technocratic rationality. So in the decolonizing literature, a key term that has one of the most references I've ever seen any paper have is this one that is by Eve Tuck and Kenya, and they argue in this paper that decolonization is not a metaphor. What I've been saying earlier and what I'm going to say in a few minutes again is why it actually, for our context at least, needs to be read in a quite metaphorical way. Because on the one hand, the concept of ethic of incommensurability I find really forward-looking and carrying you somewhere, but the definition of decolonization is really focused on the American, and that means in some way even, yeah, the American forms of settler colonialism. So they claim that if we use decolonization metaphorically in this wider sense, outside of that settler colonialist tradition, we allow people to sort of get rid of feelings of guilt, and we don't actually seek solutions to these problems that still persist, the inequalities, the unfairness, the harm that has been done. So that is their argument. I think, and so settler colonialism, is that clear? In case it isn't, there is a little slide. The idea is that this is not of this way of looking at it. It's not an event. It is a structure. It's a structure of occupying land, extraction, profiteering, slavery, and it has two forms, can have two forms at least, comes in two forms, external and internal colonialism. But the basic idea is that you start from land, and then from the land comes the occupation of the peoples. We have been arguing in a research group that included Osiris and Joseph and several other people in this room and not, that this narrow reading on settler colonialism for the context of psychedelics really doesn't make any sense. Not because it's irrelevant, but we need to go much wider. Especially the medicalisation of psychedelics colonizes our minds, it colonizes substances, it colonizes knowledges, and it's not just about land, even though land is included in it. So to give an example of where I actually think some of the heroes of the psychedelic discourse use really problematic ways of describing what they have been doing. An example is Terrence McKenna as Eric Davis. This is from Eric Davis. I didn't make this up. Okay, so Eric Davis looks in his book High Weirdness, among other people, at the ways in which Terrence McKenna presents himself, and I'm just using this to emphasize a point of illustration. One of the curiosities about psilocybin mushrooms, Davis writes, is that very few indigenous societies seem to have been particularly interested in them. The Witoto who lived around the La Chorrera certainly had room in their pharmacopoeia for powerful hallucinogenic tryptamines. Their lack of interest in the fungi lends some support to the strong possibility that cubensis was a recent arrival to the region, having followed the excrement of Cebu cattle. Recognizing the Witoto's indifference to the psychedelic marvels in their midst, Terrence makes an odd and very telling remark in his journal entry for February 23rd. So Terrence McKenna quoted from Eric Davis, "This particular mushroom species is unclaimed, so far as I know, by any Aboriginal people anywhere, and thus is neutral ground in the tryptamine dimension we are exploring." And Davis writes, this statement is both unwarranted and strangely gloating. It responds with an arrogant exuberance of the colonist, delighted to stumble upon undiscovered terrain or a raw material unexplored by benighted natives. For Terrence, the plant and not the human is the teacher, which is why he was happy to get his hands on the goods and explore them and the dimension they open on neutral ground. Terrence's desire for such a place reinstalls natural science's objective gaze and rhetorical degree zero. And this, I use this to highlight that we really need to think carefully about how the psychedelic space that we are now here inhabiting, how it came about, and what we actually admire in it, what we revel in, and think carefully what it might have some implications that were maybe not that visible at the time, but certainly today we have to be much more mindful. So the two problems with this is, of course, that if you say it's a plant teacher, you actually forgot that it was Maria Sabina who taught Gordon Wasson. So there is something when indigenous people use plant teacher, there is a very different meaning to when actually Terrence McKenna uses plant teacher. And I want to make us aware of this. Another aspect is to look at, as he does, and I think that is a genuine misuse that determines the boundary where I said I want a wide reading. I don't want that wider reading. I don't want to say that mushrooms themselves are colonizers because they somehow came with this cattle of the colonizers and now they have sort of taken the space over. Mushrooms are just mushrooms. They do what mushrooms do. They don't extract profit. They don't enslave people. They're just there. So this is where we won't go with a wide reading of decolonization. Now, what are the colonizations in the psychedelic space? And why do I think that it really makes sense to use this lens to look at it? We are colonizing objects, that is psychoactive plants, rare animals, but also indigenous knowledges, rituals, and practices, indigenous peoples and persons, but also human minds, our own minds possibly might be colonized in some of the processes around the medicalisation of psychedelics in particular. So our minds and experiences, as well as hopes and needs. And the methods being used are very classically colonial methods: extraction, appropriation, adaptation, synthetic reproduction, marketization, and of course, profit. To expand on this, now that gets me to my first point, just delineating more of what I've just been setting the scene for. The biocultural colonization means really appropriation of plants, that we grow them in pots and in farms and in huge sort of monoculture, if possible, that we prepare them in kitchens and we modify or synthesize their components in the laboratory and ideally get a patent for it. So what would this mean for a decolonizing ethic? It would mean respecting and crediting indigenous knowledge and technologies, thinking about land use, carefully thinking about land use. I'm not sure a colonization with psychedelic plants is so much better than with cocoa, coffee, or sugarcane. Then there are questions of the physical, agriculture, and technological extractions, questions of ownership, practices of modification and patenting, that is commodification, extraction, and appropriation. And then, of course, who gets the profits? We see now in the psychedelic space some movements that go from the indigenous to the Western and back. And I've just given a few examples here. We go there, we study and observe and bring back. That's not a criticism, but if Genia Fortiou, who did a lot of this herself, has been criticizing this recently, how you go there and make some other people's your objects and their practices. And even as an academic, because you get at least a paper out of it or a talk at this conference for that matter. Then there is another going there, that is psychedelic tourism, ayahuasca tourism and retreats. And this question of, is this really authentic? What is the kind of idea of authenticity that we entertain when we think going in something that is now a very commercialized, Western-oriented treatment place? I don't have an answer for this, okay? I'm just, at this point, posing this as a question, thinking about what do we do here in this sort of authentic, non-authentic experience. Another thing is hosting indigenous practitioners and bringing them here you have other sort of ways in which you then exoticize when you farm our Western retreats with indigenous practitioners who are taken totally out of context. It doesn't change the fact that you have very different perceptions and worldviews. And then, of course, we have it now in the industrialized psychedelic medical sector, where people bring indigenous peoples, an indigenous person or two on board, and they help us look more diverse, shape the profile, get some token input of some token indigenous person that seems to then make it okay. Yeah? In the clinical colonization space, I think it is really, that we need to realize that the biopharmaceutical industry and the way in which medical research proceeds cannot be separated. The ways in which they have for 100 years at least mutually informed and shaped each other is not something one can simply disentangle. And we see this recreated. But so the drug development and business decisions that are taken in the sort of more pharmaceutics and patents and drug patent orientated market side shape the ways in which we need to create scientific evidence to get regulatory approvals. So the scientific evidence and how it is being created is not created that way because that is the only or the best way to create it. It is created partly that way because there is a whole range of very administrative bureaucratic processes in place that then give to this legitimacy. And if we look at the clinical trials in psychedelics, this becomes particularly uncomfortable from my point of view. So one issue with medicalization, with the psychedelic psychotherapy is, of course, that you need a diagnosis to qualify. That means that you are fully in the mindset of medicalization, and the authority structure is quite clear in this process. I've mentioned the ideologies of evidence production and what is legitimate evidence. I think there's lots of evidence for what psychedelics do, tons and tons. This particular way of producing it has a lot of pitfalls and problems. Then, of course, we collect a lot of data with this. Who owns this data? What is happening with this data when all these people have to report in standard questionnaire and other forms? Where does this data go? There have been suggestions to actually even create a big multi-trial database where we bring all these patient experiences in. I'm finding this a form of colonizing people's experience and potentially profiteering from it in multiple ways that is highly problematic. And then, of course, the clinical space, too, has been troubled with problems of sexual harassment and different forms of abuse and questionable forms of consent. Are there ways of sort of non-exploitative learning? Can we actually adopt indigenous practices without adopting an indigenous worldview, which we simply just like that can't? Is there a way in which we can at least find ways of working together or find ways of integrating, as the paper that Claudia cited developed, that try to prevent a loss of indigenous knowledge, the destruction of present indigenous cultures, which is really important when you think what ayahuasca tourism, for example, does in many indigenous places. And this has really many sides to it. This is a complex problem that is emerging here. And then, of course, the extinction or mutation of psychedelic producing plants and animals when they are grown and farmed and used and harvested in the ways that are on the cards. So I leave this out. There is a big industry market interest in the medicalisation of psychedelics within the psychiatric regimes, and we just need to be aware of this. So there are power issues, and I want to give an example of this that I found really in clinical trials, that patients are somehow really strangely treated as passive exemplars. So you standardize as much as you can to recruit them to the trial, and then they all undergo the same protocol, which is the point and the method of the clinical trial, but it does exactly what Adorno called the big problem with the whole Western way of knowing. This sort of rationality that doesn't really care. It just needs to classify. And so this use of patients as exemplars is one example of this. Another problem is the commodification and fetishization in Karl Marx's sense of the substances that seem to be key to the process. Susanna's paper is really interesting in that regard. What is it actually that does the curing? And the multiple ways in which a substance can be seen and work. And then there is a therapeutic aim generally. That is a general criticism of the anti-psychiatrists in the 1970s and 80s against psychiatry, that its main aim is not to make people really well. It is to make them function well. That is not the same. And we need to question the ways in which some of the trials are being designed, especially the trials that think about using psychedelics without a psychedelic trip. Yeah? Whether maybe you could just use it as you would paracetamol and you would get all the effects of the person no longer suffering or being able to work and do what we expect normal and healthy people to do and be like. So there are attitudes to life, relations, and nature that are problematic within this. The third aspect are the internal colonizations. So this question of, can we self-direct in expanding, seeking expansions of consciousness or different ways of feeling and being in the world and with others and in nature? Or is this something that really needs to be under the very careful guise of the medical professionals that give us the direction and determine the dose and tell us when our experience is to peak and not? I get to this. So do we need, how many laws and regulations do we really need to make psychedelics something that could be helpful and a positive force in society? And this is a tricky problem because there's as much chance it could be a very negative force, as Masya mentioned and others. The ways in which psychiatry or psychology as the science that actually first tells us what is mad, then declares who is mad, and then uses something that it has itself declared to be madness to cure you of your madness is an interesting configuration in this. An example for why I say that this with the exemplar and the way in which we are sort of individualized is that I've been looking at these music playlists because I found intuitively the whole idea that everybody gets to listen to the same music really, really odd, because people do know and respond differently to different musics, right? So I'm from Bayreuth. If you play me the Ride of the Valkyries, you're definitely not getting me anywhere other than angry, probably, on a trip. So the onset of the drug, this is quoted directly from the Johns Hopkins website that explains this to us, is that the music is created to create an unfolding, and it has a dependable structure. There is a net of reassurance, almost of leadership, that the music takes. The music helps keep participants from prematurely returning to normal conscious awareness. Prematurely, who defines that? So this is not your trip, right? This is a choreographed trip where someone else knows when you have to reach the height of your trip, whatever that is supposed to be, and when you are coming back down or out. So there is you're truly trying to shift consciousness beyond the level of the everyday self, and you have to go beyond language, and music is what does that. The music that actually choreographs. It's the conductor of the trip you are having in the setting. I'm finding this really annoying. I don't know how you feel. So I think an ethics of care in the psychedelic space, in a medical intention or maybe a not so medical intention, should go definitely without playlists and without eye shades and with no enforced passivity lying on a couch for 4 hours, but rather really give people freedom to find out how they have the experiences they wish to have, or that challenge them to move and change the way they are in this world. It means engaging with others, with people, with plants, and with animals. So the practice that we need then for the psychedelic space. When we think about a decolonizing practice, it is one of an attitude of care that looks at what is appropriate in the use if we conduct clinical research, what is actually an appropriate way of doing this, then searching for consensual practices in the ways in which we respect who contributes what to this clinical experience. And that means also recognizing the peoples, the knowledges, the plants, and the animals that actually create this space in which this currently operates. Establishing methods of fair compensation and sustainable production for recovery and flourishing. And that includes, again, the plants and the animals that are, some of which are on the verge of dying out, where you can see a big psychedelic boom, not actually being something that from any perspective of environmental awareness, sustainability, or diversity of life on the planet can be recommended. And then, of course, providing patients, participants, and users with the freedom to find their own path, to not have a trip that is conducted by somebody else's fancy for particular playlists of music and how they feel when they hear that. Another last point is, of course, to refuse to participate. If you think something is problematic, then there is an ethic. In recent years has been developed what is called an ethic of refusal. It is the space in which you say, no, we shouldn't do that. That's my last slide. In order to do this, however, what we need is far more research into these different contexts, in which particular plants that are used to create psychedelic substances or from which we take the information that we need, the animals that are sort of harvested as producers of psychedelic trip-inducing substances, etc., how we actually care for them. We know far too little about this. We need much more social science and humanities research, of course we do, to actually really think through some of these problems that these last five talks, including this one, have been trying to outline. I think we have really not thought critically and in a sustainable and ethical way really about what the psychedelic renaissance means from the point of view of animals, plants, and indigenous peoples in particular. Thank you.